This week, Texas House Republicans unveiled the first draft of their new congressional map as they look to take 5 seats in next year's midterm elections. Now, they're targeting Democratic members of Congress in majority minority districts in Austin, Dallas, the Houston metro area, and South Texas. This atypical mid-decade redistricting comes amid a pressure campaign from President Trump, who is dealing with a razor-thin House majority and unfavorable conditions leading up to those elections. The final map is sure to get some legal pushback. In fact, according to the Texas Tribune, a federal court found that Texas did, in fact, violate the Voting Rights Act in a previous congressional map it unveiled decades ago. And our current congressional map is facing legal challenges as we speak. Now, I wanted to give you that quick update, but stick around for my conversation with senior political analyst at thirdway.org, David De La Fuente, where we break down the political landscape here in Texas, the Texas GOP's plan, what's at stake, and how gerrymandering impacts not only elections, but also you. Texas lawmakers are currently in a special legislative session where Governor Abbott has outlined about 18 agenda items, including the need for more flood warning systems in the wake of the deadly flooding in Central Texas this summer, arguments over THC and hemp, but also the redrawing of the congressional district maps, something that typically happens about every decade after a U.S. census. Now, President Trump called on the Texas GOP to pick up 5 more seats in an almost deadlocked House and ahead of a potentially dicey midterm election cycle. Now, Democrats argue that this could mute majority-minority congressional districts here in Texas, but some Republicans are also concerned that their seats might be affected too. But before we unpack all that, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. It's free of charge and supports the channel. Joining me today is David De La Fuente, senior political analyst with thirdway.org. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Nicole.
Thank you for coming on. Before we get into the specifics, can you talk about what the current partisan breakdown in the House is right now? What are we looking at here in Texas politically?
Yeah, so in Texas, for the federal House seats, Texas has 38 districts. That's up 2 from the last decade. That's been in effect since the 2022 election cycle. Texas, of those 38 seats over the last 2 elections, where the 38 seats have been in effect and the current maps have been in effect, Republicans have won 25 seats, Democrats have won 13. One of those 13 is currently vacant with a special election scheduled for November 2025, but Democrats should easily retain that seat after the special election. So Republicans do have a very large 25 to 13 seat advantage that has been really locked in the past 2 election cycles.
And as I was mentioning earlier, on July 7th, Trump's DOJ sent a letter to Texas demanding redistricting on the basis that 4 majority-minority Black and Brown congressional districts were unconstitutional under racial gerrymandering under the Voting Rights Act, which there's been attorneys that have already come out and dispute that. Can you kind of break that down further in terms of like what they're attempting to argue?
Yeah, it's really a smokescreen argument from the Trump Department of Justice. It was an attempt to give Texas Republicans, specifically Governor Abbott, cover to put redistricting on a special session agenda. Obviously, mid-decade redistricting is 100% legal. It just is. But it is very odd for it to be taken up in a special session after this was not really on anyone's radar during the regular session. The Trump Department of Justice is going after 4 districts, 3 in Houston, 1 in the Dallas area, that are, as you mentioned, coalition districts. Coalition districts are those that various ethnic and racial minority groups who share similar political desires, wants, needs, preferences are put in districts together to elect a candidate that all groups that should receive some form of protection can agree with. So the one in the Dallas area is Texas's 33rd district. It's actually where I'm calling in from. I live in Congressman Mark Vesey's district myself on the Dallas side of it. That is a district that was actually formed in its initial in the initial map in 2011. It was redrawn in 2021, but it was drawn in 2011 to give a voice to mainly the African American community in Tarrant County and the Latino community in Dallas County, which that was a huge primary fight in the 2012 election cycle. But Congressman VC has enjoyed large support both from the African American and Latino communities, especially in general elections, ever since he was first elected. Coalition districts are not required by the Voting Rights Act, but they have been used really across the country for a long time as a way to give protections to groups that are clearly protected by the Voting Rights Act, and mostly it's mostly in cases where you cannot draw enough adequate districts that are solely representative of these communities. Sometimes in a place like Texas, for instance, you could draw a Latino majority district in Dallas. They've chosen not to. They've chosen to use this coalition district. And by they, I want to be clear, it was Republican majority in the Texas legislature back in 2011. They use this as a way to satisfy legal concerns that the growing Black and brown population in Dallas-Fort Worth needed a second district that met some VRA standards back then. And the Trump DOJ right now is essentially arguing that it needs to be dismantled. I mentioned earlier it's a smokescreen, and that is because while we have not seen the maps that the Republicans are going to at least initially put forward pending any amendments, I think it's highly unlikely that the districts that the Trump DOJ mentioned are going to be the real targeted districts. It's probably going to be those that are not technically coalition districts, like Texas's 7th district, which was down in Houston, not in the letter. Texas's 32nd up in Dallas, not on the letter, as well as the 2 remaining seats held by Democratic congressmen in South Texas, the 28th Senate in Laredo and the 34th Senate in McAllen and Brownsville area.
Now, one thing that, you'd mentioned how this is a smokescreen. And one thing I found interesting when I was first reading about this is that some years ago, during the last redistricting attempt, one of the arguments that Republicans were making is that we're making it race blind. I believe that was the term that they were using. So if that was, something that they were trying to do then, it kind of negates the argument now that these are just what they're saying is racial gerrymandering under the Voting Rights Act, because beforehand we were told that was what they were attempting to do, and now they're saying it's not being done, or it hasn't been done.
Yeah, and these maps that were drawn in 2021 have been in litigation since then. Hats off to civil rights progressive groups that have put forward these lawsuits. They are at least and they're in Texas court, so that comes with that caveat. Federal courts that are Texas based, and they're not likely to succeed in the near future. It's important to bring them forward, but the Texas government's response, like you said, has essentially these were not racially motivated decisions. These essentially, they argued the reason that the state is so gerrymandered is to help Republicans, help conservatives. It's not to punish, or hurt or take away the voting rights of African Americans, of Latinos, of other, non-majoritarian groups here in the state. And the Trump DOJ has essentially made them flip their argument. It's going to be interesting. We'll talk about it more later, I'm sure. But if they do end up passing a new map, it seems like the Trump administration has forced Texas Republicans to make themselves uniquely vulnerable to a legal argument in a way that they haven't really since the mid-2000s.
Yeah, and I was I was going to get to that point that
Yep.
you were just mentioning right there, because I do think that this could create issues for Republicans, and not only just for campaigning purposes. The optics of this doesn't look good. And this is something that Republicans are going to have to answer to as they are trying to, keep their seats and things of that nature, because it does. I mean, it's somewhat, it's the White House putting its stamp on what's happening here in Texas,
Yeah.
trying to force something, I should say.
Yeah. And if you're, a Democrat or more, left of center leaning in general, and you don't like the fact that, the maps have been what they are, I think what's important to remember in this, as we move forward, though, is that the Republicans in the state of Texas, Governor Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, the speakers at the time, and all their lieutenants, they are very shrewd people. They are very smart. They are very good tacticians. They drew the maps in 2021 that they thought would give them the best opportunity to lock in a durable, solid majority. They drew 25 seats in 2021 for two reasons. One, and this is very important to remember here, is that redistricting is not just partisan, but it's also parochial. Essentially, you have to protect the individual incumbents themselves. They drew these 25 districts for 25 people in mind. And, on the flip side, again, it is very partisan. They did not draw 13 Democratic districts on a 38 district map out of the goodness of their heart. They did it because they thought, from a partisan perspective and protecting the 25 people they cared about, they maxed out at 25. If they could have drawn a 26 seat for somebody, they would have. And whether that be, the partisan backlash, not necessarily, convincing people to vote Democratic per se, but, districts falling apart mid-decade. Essentially what happened to Pete Sessions and John Culberson in 2018 when Colin Allred and Lizzie Fletcher defeated them. But they had to protect a lot of these Republican incumbents from potential primaries. They had to protect them from, general elections that could be competitive 10 years in the future. And the Trump administration asking them to go and find him 5 more seats is not something they would have done naturally themselves, because they all know deep down that this is bad for them. They're almost certainly going to have to do it because Trump is their leader, and Trump can make them do things because they're afraid of what Trump can do to them in, let's say a primary next year. But they all know this is a bad idea, especially long term.
And I was reading, I think it was according to somewhere in Texas Tribune, a Cook Political Report, that 2 seats. So we've got Henry Crayer in Laredo and Vicente Gonzalez of McAllen, and nestled between that district is Representative Monica De La Cruz's seat, and hers could be in jeopardy. She's Republican. Hers could be in jeopardy. So do lawmakers have an avenue to push back on this effort? Because again, as we said, there are some Republicans that may be thinking, wait a minute, my seats could be in jeopardy. How can they go about something like this when, as you said, there is that fear among the GOP that Trump could primary them or just, do something to blow them out of the water, essentially?
Yeah, I certainly tip my hat to all the Democratic state senators and state representatives that are, effectively fighting back. But ultimately, what this is going to hinge on is Republicans, especially Texas congressional Republicans, kind of growing a backbone, going back to the Trump, his political team, and others in his orbit, and telling them, we cannot survive this. We cannot survive this redraw the way you think we can. Monica De La Cruz, who represents, the 15th district, as you said, that stretches from Hidalgo County, which is like McAllen area, on north. And it used to be a Democratic district, but Republicans in 2021 saw an opportunity to redraw it, given a combination of a few things, but mostly shifting voting patterns in South Texas. That is, a district that is 80% Latino. but votes Republican due to, changing voting patterns, as well as a very smart redraw on the Republican side. The Hidalgo County part of that district still votes for the Democratic challengers for De La Cruz. Like, she hasn't won it in either of her past two elections, and some of the bordering counties don't as well. But it stretches far enough north into areas of the northern part of South Texas, closer to, say, San Antonio area, that are much more heavily Republican, and they'll outvote the portions in the valley. Like you mentioned, she's nestled between two Democratic districts, and one of them is nestled against the Gulf of Mexico. So, where else can it go but into her territory, perhaps? So they're really making a lot of Republicans vulnerable. There's others, you mentioned De La Cruz, who would be vulnerable potentially to a general election. There's others like Tony Gonzalez in Texas's 23rd district that he would not be vulnerable in a general election, but because he is viewed as insufficiently MAGA and loyal to Trump by some primary voters, last time he barely won his primary. He got forced to a runoff and won it in single digits. If I was Representative Gonzalez, I would not want to roll the dice with a bunch of new primary voters who have never seen him on the ballot and will only see him as somebody who's insufficiently MAGA. Based on the fact that he has been in office now since the 2020 election cycle, that has built in goodwill, even, with some more right-leaning Republican voters, constituency services, his voting record, et cetera. You take away that incumbency advantage with people that are used to seeing with him, used to interacting with him, that makes him that gives him a dangerous primary. Same could be said of Dan Crenshaw in Houston.
And what avenues do Democrats have to push back on what's happened, given the partisan breakdown here in Texas? What can they do? I've heard from some that are promising to be very vocal this session.
Yeah, I mean, for like the average listener or person at home, I'd say, show up, make your voice heard by contacting your representatives. In general, right now, and in most issues, I would say, reach out to your actual two representatives, your state senator, your state rep. You could call your congressman too, just to let them know how you feel. There are going to be virtual and in-person almost town hall hearings. We're recording this on Thursday, the 24th, and I believe the State House one for the Central and South Texas areas is happening for the State House probably right now, or about to convene. Really just make your voice heard and let people know, let elected officials know that you disapprove of this. For the elected officials themselves, the Democratic state reps and state senators, they don't have a lot of options. They could try to filibuster a bit to drag out these proceedings. They could even go, the nuclear option and do a quorum break, though that has its disadvantages as well. As you mentioned at the top, there's a 18 item agenda. Now, granted, Democrats don't love every single one of the 18 items, even past this redistricting one, but there are some true critical bipartisan, nonpartisan ones, including, the flood relief and preparedness issues that you mentioned. There's some other ones that are serious business as well. And if the Republicans play with the calendar to put redistricting at the top, that could essentially force Democrats not to leave because too much important stuff remains. Granted, that would require the Republicans getting their act together enough to produce a map that would satisfy both Trump as well as the 25 Republican incumbents. And that might be a sticking point for them.
And I wanted to ask about that, specifically about breaking quorum. We've seen that happen before here in Texas when Democrats broke, and there can be some blessings to that in terms of maybe raising some national awareness, but there also can be a drawback. Can you kind of dive into that deeper?
Yeah, and the law has changed. So now they are punished with fines, which has never really been the case before, and they can't pay them out of their campaign accounts, for instance. So it will come at a huge personal toll for these elected officials. Arguably, this is part of what they signed up for, part of public service and representing their communities. But I do think constituents need to show them some grace in this. With the idea of a quorum break, it is extremely physically, personally, emotionally taxing on elected officials when they do it. You're basically asking them to leave their home, their business, their community for a prolonged period of time. These just because this special session has a deadline of 30 days doesn't mean that Abbott couldn't call a second special session, or even a third, and just keep going until they get it done. I do think the Democratic delegation in the House and the Senate, they do need to show fight, but part of me does wonder if showing too much fight in this instance, and I would never say this in any other redistricting situation, but in this case, showing too much fight could actually help unite the Republican caucus around this idea that they do need to press forward with redistricting at a time when it is clear that Abbott and state Republicans know that this is politically not the smartest thing to do. And if they can find a way to convince Trump to just let the map stay, remind him that a 25-13 delegation is already an extremely gerrymandered, kind of greedy map for them, and to just let it stay. We've talked about Henry Cuellar Vicente Gonzalez's district down in Laredo and the Valley. These are districts that voted for Donald Trump in 2024. The Republicans already have very viable targets, electorally speaking, on the current map. If they play their cards right, get really good candidates, and they actually already have some announced, they could, on this current map, stretch it to 27-11. I think the redraw is really not necessary for them to look at potential pickups in Texas. And it's really going to require Republicans reminding Trump and reminding DC Republicans that this is just a half-baked idea.
Do you think that, because I was going to ask how aggressive do you think this redistricting would be, but given our conversation and what's at stake for even some of these Republicans, it seems like they're going to have to walk that fine line between, as you said, there's already, the map is already greatly in their favor, and Trump is wanting more, and they have that fear of, if they go against him, what's going to happen to them later on down the line. Do you think this specific issue, and in the times that we're living in, are they able to walk that line and maybe try to either push this back in order to appease Trump? I mean, is this something that's even feasible at this point? It seems like we're in kind of like an all or nothing phase of politics nowadays.
Yeah, I don't think Texas Republicans can defy Trump. I think they can potentially convince him that this is not the path forward. There is going to be a mandatory congressional redraw in Ohio. They are required to do it. I think it's a lot easier to do it up there, both politically and, public backlash, perhaps. It's also better political geography up in Ohio. An understated thing is that despite the fact that Texas is a, Republican leaning state, Republicans win every statewide election. And even under truly fair maps, they would win the state house, they would win the state Senate, they would win the congressional majority. The political geography of Texas, where people live and how do they vote, actually favors Democrats compared to their statewide voting patterns. So that is why being so aggressive in gerrymandering in Texas is actually kind of difficult, versus in Ohio, the political geography actually favors Republicans. So going and picking up another seat or two up there is actually easier than it is here, from just a pure number standpoint. And if that is a little bit confusing, think about, how election results come in Texas. And Republicans are really having to protect themselves right now in some of these suburban areas. But most Texans live either in urban or suburban counties.
True.
And a lot of the Republican incumbents come from these suburban counties. Like, you look at the Dallas-Fort Worth delegation, and how many Republicans there are, but their districts have to stretch all over the state to justify them continuing to hold their seats. It's hard. It's hard to go just a lot more aggressive than they already are.
And as you mentioned, this special session is about 30 days, but Abbott has done before and can call another one if he really wants to try to push something forward. Is this issue, given as tenuous that it is and what's at stake for both sides of the aisle, is this something that can get done in 30 days? Do you foresee, I know we don't have a crystal ball, but do you foresee this as an issue that Abbott may say, you know what, we're going to come back another 30 days? Is something, or do they kind of slow walk this until maybe Trump's attention is put elsewhere?
I mean, that's a great question. It's really hard to predict. I'm actually a little bit shocked that we haven't seen any rumblings of a map yet. We're on day 4 of the special session. Time, is moving, and it's moving fast. And again, it's technically easy to draw a map that can, pick up another, 3-4 Republican seats statewide. But it goes back to that thing that we've been talking about quite frequently of, you have to protect the 25 individual Republicans. And they have such, personal feelings and political needs of what is in their district and what is not in their district, that is going to be the part that could prolong this. The special session agenda, as you mentioned, has 18 items. Abbott could potentially add more, though it seems unlikely for anything other than, it being ceremonial. For instance, Briscoe Kane, a state rep down in Houston, Republican, today, introduced a resolution honoring King of the Hill coming back on television. That's one of those things that, could fly through the House and Senate, but Abbott has to bless it. But again, things get added, things, die in special sessions. So it's really a matter of just how long does it take them to agree to a map. And again, you're basically getting, 25 people to sign on to something, and that's going to be hard.
And if for your average Texan at home who is maybe mildly paying attention to this, or even some that are concerned about it, if the maps were to get redrawn even more than, Republicans favor than they are right now, how would your average Texan be affected?
Yeah, I mean, another reason why this is, I think, complicated to get done, though, I think it's more likely than not that it does, is, you take anyone that is, in need of federal assistance right now. Think of somebody that's having trouble with their Social Security or their Veterans Affairs benefits, or maybe it's a 18-year-old trying to go to a service academy, which usually require congressional nominations. For wide swaths of the state, whether you're in a Democratic, Republican, or swing part of the state, if the lines are redrawn, the people handling your cases, the people helping you with things, are going to change just like that one day. By January of 2027, and that does have a big impact. You see stuff fall through the cracks during normal congressional redistricting, the cycle that happens after that. And it is very, very tough for people. People do suffer as part of that. Granted, we have to do this every 10 years, and it's just part of representative government. The state, or really Trump forcing the state to do it right now, people will suffer that need the federal government for help. From a more political standpoint, I do think it increases distrust in government. People don't like gerrymandering and view it as corrupt and self-dealing. Usually, things of that nature, whether it be, stock trading or self-enrichment aspects that you see out of Congress, tend to be some of the things that make people the most distrustful of government. And this would certainly be that. I think people will be more likely to just write off, that the fact that their congressman is there to help them or cares about them.
I was reading an article on thirdway.org, and they were talking about different strategies taking on Trump and the agenda. And I found it was interesting because one of the things that this article was mentioning was separating the signal from the noise. Can you explain that? I thought that was very interesting, and I wanted people to hear what that was.
Yeah, so I think it's really an issue of saliency. So there are a lot of things that the Trump administration is doing that, people disapprove of. They might be morally wrong. They might be politically unpopular, economically irresponsible. But normal people only have the capacity to, focus on, a certain amount of things before really returning to their daily lives, and going about caring for themselves, their family, their community, their jobs, etc. So there are a lot of things the Trump administration are doing that are not politically popular, but are just not necessarily breaking through with the average person because they don't feel it impacts their life as much. Versus there are things that Trump and his administration are doing that are extremely unpopular and are the things that are what is right now driving down his approval ratings. So the memo you talked about is from the spring, and at the time it was tariffs. People really felt that tariffs were inflationary, were rising prices, were hurting them when they were going to the grocery store or making larger purchases, and people really cared. There's other things, again, in the spring, Elon Musk was still really part of the administration, and, Musk's self-dealings, the Trump administration giving him preferential contracts, things like data privacy, because, Musk was turning over or potentially turning over people's personal data to companies such as his own. These were the types of things that were really, really breaking through. Right now, I think it's probably things out of the big reconciliation bill, things like Medicaid cuts, things like, or really anything regarding stripping people of healthcare insurance, whether that be public or private, because obviously we're going to see people kicked off of Medicaid or lose their state Medicaid programs. People are going to lose access to subsidies in the Affordable Care Act. Rural hospitals could be closing. Things like that are extremely salient right now, almost certainly. And at the same time, I think the corruption argument is still a through line. It's less probably about Elon Musk right now, but probably more about, Trump protecting himself from the release of the Epstein list. And people view that as very self-interested. Most people probably don't know that the House has basically adjourned early to protect Trump. But, it is essential, it's one of those things that people do know that Congress is like stalling releasing these. And so that's what we talk about in terms of, the signal versus the noise. Other issues, people might care about, but they're just not breaking through to the average voter, regardless of whether they lean left, center, or even some of the Trump skeptics on the right. They're just not breaking through as much.
And how does that change? How can Democrats or independents who want to break in there? How can one break through? Given that, as you mentioned, when polled on these issues, they're deeply unpopular, but there does seem to be some type of disconnect.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a good reminder that people don't need to give up their values per se. They don't need to give in to the terrible things the Trump administration is doing. So, for instance, the mass deportations and raids that are happening they're not popular by any means. They're like folks that don't like what the Trump administration is doing, and they may personally really care about these issues because it either affects them personally or just their moral compass is that they can't, stand by as these atrocities take place. They don't need to change how they feel about it at all, or compromise, with the Trump administration. But I think it is a recognition that for the average voter that does not tune in to, cable news or posts all the time on social media about politics, these are stories that they don't like, but does not move them to action, does not move them to perhaps go and vote in 2026 for a Democratic nominee for Congress. And so that is just something to monitor. It could eventually become a more salient issue, but you really look back to, say, like the 2018 playlist the Democrats used to flip 40 seats in the House in the first Trump midterm. That was an election mainly fought on the Democratic side on healthcare, on economics, and on corruption. And basically the polling we're seeing, Third Way's conducting polling on it, our friends are, doing so as well. The individual things are changing, obviously. Like the type of corruption now is a little bit different than it was then. Back then, it was more, people wanted candidates who were not going to take corporate PAC money. And so you saw a lot of Democrats running on something like that. Now it's probably going to be banning stock trading, things like that. Like those things change, but the playbook against Trump is probably still going to be economics, healthcare, corruption, and self-dealing. And I think if Democrats keep their eyes on that ball, they could set themselves up for a successful 2026.
And actually, that leads into my. That's what I was going to ask you. What you would advise them to keep talking about and kind of driving those messages home. So and you've answered that. So on that note, this leading into the midterms, what are you going to be looking out for, and what would you advise your average Texans to be really paying attention to going into this next midterm election?
Yeah, I think, really keeping folks' eyes on the ball on that. This is really going to be about the United States House, similar to 2018. It's, can Democrats take back the House? A lot of the best opportunities, regardless of whether we have this map or even the new map, are probably going to be in places outside of Texas or even some of the surrounding states. So if people want to volunteer or donate, they really need to look at some of these what are called red to blue races, potential flip opportunities in places like Iowa and Pennsylvania, in Nebraska, in New York State, California. And if a Democrat who really cares about the majority and taking back the House has a limited budget, which almost all political donors do, really focus on giving money to some of these folks, especially post-primary next year, that are the folks that have already won their nomination. Focus on giving to them rather than the Democrat that you love, that you see on MSNBC every night. Like the Democratic incumbent in a safe district does not need your money. The Democrat running to flip a seat in Iowa does need your money.
Exactly right. Again, thank you so much. Great information. Thank you, David, for joining me today. And again, if you like this kind of content, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe.